Good evening. Welcome to our discussion and our shir on Parashat Korach. You know the story of Korach. Well, there was a rebellion against Moshe in the wilderness. It did not end well for Korach and the rebellion. It's an image that anyone that ever studied Torah is quite familiar with. That Korach and all the participants in this rebellion did not survive. The nation itself cries out to Moshe at some point saying, listen, look what you caused. And the parsha ends off with a section that is known as the section of boundaries. So in chapter 18, which is the second half of the parsha, the Torah tells us, listen, there has to be boundaries there. You are a Jew, that's wonderful. Know your limits, play within it. In other words, don't try to be spiritual by entering into the tabernacle, because that's beyond your boundary. If you're a Levite, stick to your job. So that's what the parsha is about. Now, you know that rabbis often have the job of giving a drasha. A sermon is more than an insight into the parsha. A sermon or a drasha is insight into life. In other words, there's an expectation that the rabbi is familiar with what is taking place in the world. He is also familiar with tradition. He's familiar with the text of Torah, and could really share with us his feelings, his thoughts about contemporary issues and how to view them, how to look at them based on a Torah perspective. That's what we want when we tune into a drasha. So based on that, there's a very fascinating Rashi that introduces us to this week's parsha. This is a parsha of machloket, of division, of rebellion. These are not good things. And Rashi starts off and he tells us that you should know, Parashat zu, that this section of Torah, Yafeh nidreshet b'midrash Rabbi Tanchuma. In other words, if you look at the midrashim, there's a lot of material that you could find in the midrashim that explain to us what is taking place in Parashat Korach. And some have focused on the fact that Rashi decides to share with us as an opening statement. There's a lot of midrash on Parashat Korach. There's a lot of midrash on machloket. And what Rashi is telling us is the following. You should know that midrash was an opportunity for rabbis in previous generations to get up, analyze the Torah, share with us traditions, and give us a message as how to live. When we study Torah, it is not just text from 3,400 years ago that we are curious what it means. It's something we want to apply to life, right? We have struggles in life. There are issues that we would deal with as individuals, as communities. We need guidance. We need a Torah perspective. And therefore, notes Rashi, Parashazu, this parasha gives you an opportunity for a lot of drashot, for a lot of such talks, for a lot of such sermons, because unfortunately, reality is in Jewish communities, we have this issue of machloket. People have different opinions. That's not really the problem. The problem is that people have different opinions and they have egos. And as a result of the fact that they have an ego, when someone challenges their opinion, it is challenging the person themselves. Sometimes you can have two people that when it comes to a fight of power, even if the opinions are quite similar, reality is that both individuals want the power, want the recognition, want the honor, want the kavod. And we have machloket. So this is a parsha that we're supposed to analyze and understand, because to the best of our ability, we got to do our part in avoiding machloket, bringing shalom to Klal Yisrael and to communities. So it's a very important parsha to analyze. In every generation, different rabbis have shared insights. And some of them are quite fascinating because it tells you a lot about the person and about the generation that they are talking about. For example, one of the great Hasidic masters of the early days of the Hasidic movement was Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Horovitz, known as the Chose of Lublin, the Chose of Lublin. And he was a very spiritual individual, very inspiring. And he presents analysis that relates to the first pasuk in this week's parasha, when Korach is introduced with the name of his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. Korach, we are told, is the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kehat, the son of Levi, which happened to be great people. Yitzhar, Kehat, Levi, great individuals. And there's Korach. So what exactly is being communicated here? Why is it that the yichus of Korach, his pedigree, his family dynasty, is shared with us as we introduce this story? So comes the Chayza of Lublin and shares with us, do you want to know what the problem of Korach was? His problem was that he relied on his yichus. He relied on the fact that he had a great father and a great grandfather and a great great grandfather, a great individuals, great people. And therefore he would wake up in the morning and look into the mirror and see himself as the son of a great man and the grandson of a great man, and thus felt that he deserves the honor. His problem was that he did not recognize the fact that yichus, if you don't do something good with it, is worthless. It serves no purpose at all. And what defines you are your decisions. Yichus could be the problem. And if Korach's battle and Korach's rebellion and the destruction that was caused is the message of this week's parsha, the parsha starts off by telling us that you should know he relied on his yichus. He relied on the fact that I'm great because my father was great, my grandfather was great, I come from a very well-respected family. That was his problem. Now, it's a fascinating insight because in the early days, the Hasidic movement was not based on individuals inheriting their position. There was a recognition if someone's great, he's going to be respected and followed. Something changed, obviously, in that movement. And by the 19th century, 20th century for sure, you become a Hasidic master if your father was a Hasidic master. And what the Chayze was really commenting on was on cultures within the Jewish world that honor was given to individuals based on their family. He was critical of it. And I wonder what he would say about the Hasidic movement of the late 20th, 21st century, when you have people that perhaps have a little bit of a problem relying on yichus. Yichus gets us nowhere. It could inspire us. And if someone knows, and I'm a big believer, that if you have the opportunity of finding out more about your ancestors, do it. Not because it is something you hang on your wall and show people, but perhaps you could be inspired. If I'm a descendant of a great man, of a great person, I'm going to try to go ahead and learn from them, try to look at works that were published by them, and maybe I could connect to them and grow from the experience. When you rely on yichus, it gets you absolutely nowhere. That's a message that the Chayze of Lublin shares with us. Now, really, what we need to do as we analyze Parshas Korach is to understand number one, Moshe Rabbeinu was not deserving at all any of the criticism that was directed towards him. And this is something that's a given. You have to walk into the parsha with an understanding that Moshe Rabbeinu did everything completely for the sake of heaven. It was not about himself. It was not about his ego. He had no interest in leading the nation. He had no interest in the headache that was called leadership. He was ready for retirement. He himself viewed life as slowing down when you reach age 80. You slow down. In the Tehillim, there is 11 chapters that are attributed to Moshe. And in one of them, he calls age 80 a time of gvurot. There's mightiness. There's mightiness that the body is still able to go ahead and function. But what is clear from his message is that age 80 is a time to start slowing down. You don't become president of the United States when you're 80, at least you shouldn't, right? You start slowing down a little bit, nothing wrong with that. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, Moshe, you're not going to South Florida. You are leading Klal Yisrael. Zero interest. And he did not take advantage at all. And he expresses it in this week's Parsha. He makes it clear. He turns to the Almighty and he says, you know what? I did not take anything from communal funds. I did not, even at a time that I had the right? I never caused harm to a soul. So therefore, what Moshe is expressing is that those challenges against me are simply unfair. Now, there's a little bit of a danger that we might take the wrong message from this week's Parsha. And that is that one is prohibited from challenging religious authority. That's not what the Torah is trying to convey. And at times, there are those who have used the Korach defense for allowing corrupt leadership, even corrupt rabbinic leadership. Because, after all, the rabbinate, in the past at least, was a position of power. And if it was a position of power where there's power, there's the potential of corruption. And there are those that allowed themselves to do what they want. And if anyone would challenge, they would cry out, they're acting like Korach. And the Torah does not want you to walk away with that idea. And therefore, this section, right, it's in the beginning of chapter 18, where the Torah tells us that, listen, the Levites and the children of Aharon have a responsibility of keeping boundaries. They have to be sure that the Israelites don't do things they shouldn't be doing. But they as well have a responsibility of not deviating from their job. And you know what that means? The Almighty has an expectation from every single one of us to do our part and make a contribution to the world. We value our tradition. And our tradition basically states that you should know humanity is important. God is concerned for the welfare of humanity. And the messages that were handed down to us are good for humanity. Now, that doesn't mean that at this moment we have to reach out and teach all members of the human race about Torah and mitzvot. But what we must understand is that when I teach my students, my children, my grandchildren, the values and the traditions and the mitzvot, I am not just doing good for myself. I am not just doing good for Klal Yisrael. I am doing good for the world. This is fundamental. Now, when we have to have that drive to make a difference, it has to be based on our talents and abilities and that which you find in your toolbox. And to go ahead and take upon yourself a role that's not yours could be destructive. So, for example, if someone is uneducated, but knows that it is important that Klal Yisrael has teachers, so therefore they decide to become a teacher, but they don't know how to read Hebrew, right? That all their knowledge is from reading things only in translation. And they believe that due to the fact that it is so important that we have educators and teachers and rabbis, I'm going to do it anyway. That's a major problem because you need to know the Hebrew language to guide halachically. Not everything is translated, and believe it or not, you can't find the answers for everything on the internet. So the desire to make a difference is not enough. A person has to look at into their toolbox and say, okay, what are my talents? Do I have the ability perhaps to inspire others to do mitzvot? Maybe that's my mission. Maybe I'm a very spiritual person and I like talking to God. Maybe I could inspire others about the importance of tefillah. Maybe I'm very good in organizing matters that relate to the community and I can make my contribution in helping the community. A person has an obligation to try to figure out in what way can I make a contribution? And there are two quite destructive tragedies that occur. Number one, when people who are not qualified believing the importance of leadership, become a leader. And what's tragic as well is when you have people that have the ability to make that difference, to teach, to inspire, to support, but they don't. Those things are tragic, okay? Now, often, when we have a machloket, when there's division in a community, when there's a fight, when there's a rebellion, when things are not clicking the way they should, the result is that you have people doing what they shouldn't be doing. They're going beyond their boundaries. Sometimes it is due to the fact that they have a big ego. Sometimes they struggle with existence and they want to have recognition and they believe that recognition will give them an identity and they go beyond their toolbox. That is when you find destruction, the churban, the destruction of the machloket, of infighting that occurs. And the parsha that appears at the end of this week's parsha, meaning chapter 18, when there's a warning, don't go beyond your boundary, stick within the area of your responsibility. It's a message to leaders. Now, let me share with you a story that appears in the Talmud. Okay, it's a story that appears in the Talmud. That once upon a time in the temple, there was a rabbi who happened to be a Levi. And his name was Yehoshua, the son of Hananiah. We'll call him Yehoshua. And Yehoshua noticed that there was an older Levi that was doing his job in the temple that happened to be to close the doors of the Bet HaMikdash. So the young Yehoshua, the Levite, tries to assist Yochanan, the older Levite, in closing the doors. So Yochanan turns to the young Yehoshua and he says, my son, meaning young man, go back, don't assist me, because within the family of the Levites, there are those that are chosen as singers, mishorerim, and there are those who are chosen as gatekeepers. When someone was chosen to be a singer, he should stick to his job. When someone, on the other hand, was chosen to be a gatekeeper, he should stick to his job. There's a prohibition of switching positions. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says to Yoshua, Chazor beni, Chazor le'achorecha, go back, because she'ata mina mishorerim, you are among those chosen to be singers and not gatekeepers. That's what he tells him. Now, the Rambam, by the way, makes it very clear that this is a serious violation, that it is one that's considered a very serious one. If you have a specific job, stick to it, stick to it. Now, what is the idea of a singer and a gatekeeper? So, you know that for Jewish leadership to succeed, you need those who provide emotional guidance, emotional support. And then you need those who give us the dry law, who act like the Levi'im, You know that Aharon HaKohen was a Ohev Shalom, Rodef Shalom. He pursued peace. And in some ways, he even bended the truth a little bit, the Midrash tells us, to bring peace. He would turn to a person and would say to him, the individual you've been fighting with for the past 15 years, he feels bad. And he would turn to the other party and say the same and bring them together, even if he actually did not have information that one party felt bad. But he was a man of shalom. He had a ahavat habriot. He loved people. He brought them close to Torah. He was the man of emotion. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, was not known for that because he had a different toolbox. He was a Levi, and a Levi works with precision, And the Levi is the one that could guide us how to practice our Judaism. There's precision, right? You have to know the halachot to understand how to warm up food on Shabbat. You have to study to understand what rooms do need a mezuzah, what rooms do not need a mezuzah. You need to study and focus on precision when you want to figure out how to lend money in a permissible way and not violate the prohibition of interest rebate. There's a demand for precision. You have to be detail-oriented. That's the Levi. Okay? Now, even among the Levi'im, there are different personalities. And there are those that could take their precision and use it in a way that inspires, not just to be those who are gatekeepers to say, you remain here and you could come in, right? The gatekeeper cannot be a very emotional person. Imagine you were hired as a bouncer in a bar, but you get very emotional if someone gets emotional and asks you to please remain in the bar, even though they had 7 drinks beyond what they should be drinking, right? You have to be tough. You have to know this is the law, that you don't belong here. You are a danger. Out you go. You have to be a Levi to be a gatekeeper. But believe it or not, there's actually one area where precision can make a contribution to the emotion as well. And that relates to music. You know that Levi'im are often musical. Historically, they were without doubt very musical. Music demands precision. You have to know when the specific note has to be played, when you go high, when you go low, right? If it's going to be in B minor or B major, not that I know what this means at all, but precision, the Levite precision can make a contribution to something that is extremely uplifting emotionally, and that is music. And therefore, in this section of the Talmud, we are told that you should know. You, said Yochanan to Yehoshua, you were chosen to be a mishorer, to sing. You have your role. Stick to your role, right? If that's your toolbox, go ahead and focus to make a contribution with what you were given to. I, on the other hand, I'm a sho'er, I'm a gatekeeper. Okay, and therefore, let's stick to our jobs. And the Torah shares with us this information after the section of Korach, because the Torah is telling us the following: to rebel against leadership that is for the sake of heaven, to rebel against leadership that is doing it because they understand that this is the right thing to do. To rebel against the Moshe Rabbeinu is unacceptable. It comes from a bad place, from a very bad place. You know that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot tells us that a dispute that is not for the sake of heaven is the dispute of Korach and Kol Adato, Korach and his whole group. And the language indicates that the dispute was not just Korach versus Moshe. Within this rebellion itself, every person was really interested in self. When you study often about rebellions or protests that come to the streets, quite often they have completely different agendas. Like if you read about Iran in the late 1970s, that they were rebelling against the Shah. There were those who were rebelling against the Shah because he was corrupt. One of the groups were these Islamists that followed Khomeini. But that was not the whole reality of those who rebelled. But once there was a rebellion and they overthrew the Shah, so the most brutal one were the ones that came to power and remain in power. Rebellions actually is the byproduct of many people with their own agenda. Machloket shehi lo leshem shamayim, when you have a government that every person is eyeing the seat of being a prime minister, it's not going to last over a year, right? Why? Because their agenda is self. Korach and his kol adato, what they had in common was that every single one of them was interested in themselves. Such a rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu is unacceptable because it's a rebellion that comes from ego against Torah. But when leadership itself is problematic, when you have a leader that doesn't know their boundaries, when they try to act beyond what they are qualified to do, right? When you have a person who is a rabbi, but he thinks he is the posek of all of North America and starts guiding and sharing halachic psak that is beyond his ability and his knowledge and doesn't recognize his limitations. When you go ahead and say to such a person, you are not doing right, this is not a Korach rebellion. This is the proper thing to say. A person, and especially a leader, needs to know their boundaries. They need to know their strengths and make contributions based on their strengths. Not every single time a person challenges leadership is it a Korach. That's what we're being told. And that's what the focus of the end of the parsha is. All of us need to know what we are doing. If we are individuals chosen to inspire through music, if we are individuals chosen to be gatekeepers, whatever the role is, stick to what you do well, because that's what God wants you to do. This is what we are told. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is what we have to do, and this is what we have to walk away with from this week's Parsha. Moshe Rabbeinu is a person that completely had no self. In other words, remember the story that when Moshe Rabbeinu is informed a few weeks ago that there are those that are acting like prophets in the camp, which I think any other leader, when he would hear that there are those that are taking over your role of prophesizing the way you prophesize, because those who were in the camp prophesizing, we were told, were acting like Moshe Rabbeinu on their own, independent. So a follower of Moshe Rabbeinu informs him, and Yehoshua says to his master, Adoni Moshe, my master Moshe, Klaim, get rid of them. In other words, they are rebelling against you. They're acting like prophets. They're taking over your role. And Moshe's response is, mi ten v'cholam Hashem. It would be so nice if everyone could do it. Moshe had zero ego. It was nothing about himself. Day in, day out for 40 years. One interest, the welfare of the people of Israel. Now, Moshe expresses this when he communicates to God Almighty about this rebellion. And he says to them, you should know, he turns to the Almighty and he says, you should know, I never hurt any one of them. In other words, my whole identity and my whole mission was the welfare of Klal Yisrael. Now, I mentioned the fact that in the Bet HaMikdash, the Levi'im were chosen for different jobs. There were those that were chosen for Shirah, for song, and there were those that were chosen as gatekeepers. Now, there were other responsibilities as well, but one could wonder, how were specific individuals chosen? How are they chosen? So there's a disagreement here between the great French rabbis of the 12th century. We call them the Ba'alei HaTosfot. They are descendants of Rashi, who established yeshivot in France. They studied Talmud in depth, and they share an opinion about how Levi'im were chosen. And then there's the opinion of Maimonides, the Rambam, contemporary of these rabbis, but with a very different opinion. The Tosfot, the French rabbis, tell us that Levi'im were chosen based on their families. In other words, if your father, who was a Levi, served as a gatekeeper, there's an expectation that you continue with that tradition. If your father, on the other hand, was a mishorer, I remember there's a family that I know, Horowitz family, one of the Horowitzes, they have magnificent voices. They are Levi'im, and it's in the family. Sometimes you have fine families that they can harmonize together. So Tosfot tells us, if within a specific family, you have those who are mishorerim, who could sing, they are chosen to inspire with music. That's the opinion of the French rabbis. Rambam, Maimonides, on the other hand, tells us that it doesn't work like that. But rather, it was a choice that was made based on personalities. And at times, Maimonides seems to indicate, based on Talmudic sources, if you have a Levi who was able to sing, but then later in life, his singing is not the same, which does happen, right? That because a person was a magnificent chazan when he is 35, it doesn't mean he's going to be a magnificent chazan when he is 95. So in such a case, the Rambam says, you move them on at some point, and you can make them gatekeepers. This is what the Rambam tells us. Now, when we talk about our personal mission and journey in life, both things are true. In other words, sometimes we are inspired by what our parents did. And believe it or not, it's very possible that in the past, you had individuals who were cobblers or who were craftsmen who did a specific work for many generations, not found today so much, but you had people who were shoemakers for many, many generations. It most probably is the way they are making a contribution to the world. Shoes are important, and there's a tremendous mitzvah being fulfilled when someone produces shoes with honesty, having in mind that he is allowing people, to walk, to enjoy the world, to produce. We call it the mitzvah of Yishuv HaOlam, the most fundamental mitzvah for humanity, is to value existence. And if you are a shoemaker or any industry that does good to society, from being a gardener to an electrician to a plumber, if you do it and you do it honestly and you do it with an appreciation for the world that was given to us, it is the mitzvah of Yishuv HaOlam that is fulfilled by millions upon millions of people throughout the world. If it is something that you had within your family, it's very possible, we could say with confidence, it is the will of Hashem that the person do it. So therefore, the Tosfot approach that the specific Levi could figure out what his personal mission is, could come from what his parents or grandparents did, makes a lot of sense. You could figure out, this is a talent that my family has, because when my father showed me how to do it, number one, it's in my genes, and number two, I learned from an expert. So that's what the Tosfot is telling us. But Maimonides is also telling us that generally this is correct, but things change, not every individual fits into the mold of their family, and there has to be a recognition of individualism as well. And therefore, according to the Rambam, it is something that could fluctuate. And when the leaders of a specific family of the Levi'im come to Jerusalem and they find someone who historically his family were gatekeepers, but he has talent, you could put him on Beis Hamikdash has talent team, and he will impress all the judges, there's no doubt that it is acceptable according to the Rambam to have that individual play his role. This is what is important. The Jewish person, to succeed in life, needs to understand that contributions need to be made. You want to figure out how to make them? Understand where your strengths are. Sometimes it comes from the family. Sometimes you could identify them in yourself. And obviously, as the world changes, and there are so many industries, right? No one could tell me that he's sixth generation computer programmer. No one could tell me that, right? No one could tell me that his Alta Zaidi in Galicia was developing apps for Apple. No one can tell me that. So obviously, as times change, you adjust. So how do I figure out what I should be doing? Okay, you figure out what you enjoy. You figure out what doesn't makes you stressful. But just as this is true when it comes to parnas, to earning a living, it must be true to our communal responsibility. And this is what we are told in the parsha. The failure of Korach was a person that, with all the great potential he had, right? He had the yichus. According to tradition, he was extremely wealthy. So he could have taken a position, and naturally, the way it works is a person has wealth, he's respected, and if he's respected, his word will be followed. He could have been a shining light, but the problem was, the drive that wants you to go beyond what you should be doing, and that leads to the destruction. One of the great authorities that I've quoted often was Rab Meir Simcha of Devinsk, the Meshech Chochmah. And he analyzes the words of Moshe Rabbeinu when he communicates to God about what is taking place, about the rebellion. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, I never, ever harmed anyone. I never harmed anyone. And the Meshech Chochmah analyzes Moshe Rabbeinu's words. And what he said, his analysis basically says, sometimes you have people that can act extremely humble next to average people. But when a colleague of theirs is one that they are compared to, then suddenly you will notice that their ego is taking off. And the example that he does not provide, but I'll give you an example. That great rabbinic figures sometimes are invited to dinners or events, conferences or conventions. And quite often there's a dais. Now, it appears that where people sit is quite important for them. I mean, it's a recognition of scholarship. If you are one of the greatest scholars in the world, there is an expectation that you sit in front. If you are a scholar, but not one of the great ones, you'll perhaps be on the dais, but towards the end. And if you're not recognized at all as a great Torah leader, you'll be in the crowd. So imagine you are a great head of a yeshiva, and you expected to be sitting there in the top 5 seats. I mean, you have many disciples, you are asked for guidance, you write articles. So you were expecting a seat in the top 5. You come in, and your seat is seat number 18. It's nice, it's high, but the problem is that you're not in the front. And when the camera will be filming the speaker on the dais, no one's going to see you. It hurts you. It hurts you. So you decide that there's no way you're going to sit on the dais at seat number 18. So you sit in one of the tables where there's a table designated for bochrim, for young boys. You just sit there. The leaders of this conference or convention come over to you and they say, Reb so-and-so, please come up. We want to be machabed you. And his response is, no, kavod is not important for me. Kavod is not important for me. I could sit here with the young boys. And he won't budge. Now, on the surface, the statement sounds very nice. He's extremely humble. He'll sit with the young boys. But the reality is, why is he sitting with the young boys? Because sitting with the young boys does not indicate at all that there's anyone greater than him on the dais, because he's not even there. But seat 18 would, at least in his mind, seem to indicate that there are 17 individuals on the dais that are of greater scholarship. That would be unacceptable for him. So this quote unquote humility that this rabbi has, that he wants to sit with the young students, is not humility at all. And Moshe Rabbeinu was a personality. that was not just humble as he interacted with the simple Jew, even as mentioned earlier, when there were others who were acting as prophets, and it would be natural for a leader to feel perhaps someone is threatening his position. Never felt a threat at all. Simply committed for the sake of heaven, completely for the sake of heaven, completely doing his job and nothing more. That's the Moshe Rabbeinu that we can never, ever rebel against. And there have been, throughout the ages, Moshe Rabbeinus. In other words, when we have great Torah leadership, when we merited to have a Chafetz Chaim, right? Or even Baruch Hashem in Eretz Yisrael, you have individuals that are completely devoted to the teachings of Torah. To go ahead and start claiming that they make decisions based on politics, that is a Korach statement, and that needs to be purged. But in no way can we be naive that if we see complete corruption, right? And obviously it has to come from someone that analyzes it in a proper way, analyzes it in a fair way. When there is corruption, God forbid, to allow the title rabbi to have someone immune from criticism, God forbid, because it's a title that unfortunately has been misused. And it's a title that's given to all kind of people. And we have to be aware of it. Never allow the Korach defense to be misused. A very significant message for a generation that has a lot of falsehood. So this is how this is some insight that we have from a very loaded parsha, and hopefully we were able to gain something from a parsha. And I think the most important thing that's relevant to all of us is that machlokus is destructive. And even when we have a lot of emotions and feelings about situations and about decisions, we have to think twice or three times before we verbalize them, right? Because once words are spoken, you can't take them back, right? Thoughts you could deal with. We all have all kind of thoughts and feelings. But when it comes to words, you're stuck, right? Every person has words that they spoke that they deeply regret that they came out of their mouth. And siyag la'chokhmah, there's nothing that protects us more than keeping our mouth shut. And Parashat Korach, the tragedy of Korach needs to be an inspiration for all of us. To have a dialogue, to go ahead and debate and share different opinions in a respectful way. There's a beautiful clip today that they had in the house of the president of Israel welcoming the new prime minister. And to what extent they mean, it was meant, I don't know, but the message sounded very nice. That the message was basically, you could have disagreements, but don't attack the individual personally. And often when there's a respectful disagreement, both parties walk away with clarity. And as the Mishnah tells us, a machloket that's for the sake of heaven is Hillel and Shammai. They had one agenda. Let's figure out the truth. Let's figure out how to make things work. So when an institution, when an organization has different views regarding matters, to communicate with respect for the individual, and to go ahead and have a conversation that everyone should hear all sides is extremely healthy. But when it turns, God forbid, into a machloket, and when we speak about others in a negative way behind their back, that is something that we realize that we're not worthy of standing on the ground in such a case. That's what the Parsha teaches us. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this shir on Parashat Korach.